discussions yesterday on the first day, we focused on health yesterday. And there was an interesting conversation about the distribution of what we called high education health workers and moderate education health workers. There was some discussion about what the implication of this is. What exactly is the right ratio of high to moderate skilled health workers? But while it's not a highly technical question, it's not a question that actually has been discussed very much. And yet, I'm struck by the fact that if we believe, as many of us believe, that the reforms of 2010 and devolution in particular are going to lead to improved outcomes, among which would be improved healthcare, improved access to health, and improved actual health outcomes, not just access. It must involve a series of decisions that are made at different levels. So if we are going to see changes in people's access, then we must see other changes. Where do those changes start? They start with the distribution of health workers. If all of the health workers are concentrated in one place, then they are not providing services to people around the country. So what we would expect to see, if things are actually working in the way that we hope that they will work, is that after devolution, health workers begin to move. Why do they move? Because counties undertake different policies to attract them and retain them. So they move from one place to another. That leads to a redistribution of health workers from high density areas to lower density areas. That then leads to a change in the mix of highly skilled versus lower skilled workers, and eventually to changes in outcomes for people, changes in people's lives. Yet here we are many years down the road, and the basic question, like, what's the right mix of health workers and how do we move from the mix of health workers that we had at the beginning in 2010 or 2013 when devolution started to where we are now and where we need to go, is not a question that there's any public discussion about. So how are we going to get from where we started to where we want to go if we don't discuss these things? Now, the last thing that I want to say about this is that one of the reasons why we have challenges participating in these conversations is because of a lack of data. It is our belief at the International Budget Partnership that governments provide information when there's demand for information. And if there's no demand, then governments will not provide that information. So we assume, on the basis of the outcomes that we are seeing, that there's not enough demand from the public to know what is happening to the money that is raised by government and how it's being used. But there's also a fundamental problem. It also came up in our discussion yesterday, and it's the last thing that I want to say about the data issue, which is that in a devolved system, somebody must take responsibility for collecting data from the devolved units, putting it together, and making it accessible. It is the only way for the public to engage. It is the only way for Parliament to exercise oversight. It is the only way for national policymakers to make intelligent decisions. The truth is that today, if you want data from the counties, you have to go to each county and get it. And that is ludicrous. That is not the way it works in other countries, and there's no excuse that that is the way it is working today in Kenya. When we made this point to the Controller of Budget, many years ago, I've given up making this case to the Controller of Budget, that the Controller of Budget should be responsible for creating the national repository of county budgets so that everyone can see the county budgets sitting wherever they are sitting at the click of a mouse. We were told that is not our responsibility. It is the county's responsibility to make information available to the public. Yes, it is the county's responsibility to make information available to the public. But the truth is that anybody who wants to know, sitting not just in Nairobi, but sitting in Kwale, sitting in Turkana, sitting in Kisumu, what their neighbors are doing, what the other counties in the region are doing, how Kisumu compares to Mombasa, cannot be expected to go to each individual county to request for information. This is simply not feasible. And therefore, if we expect evolution to work again, what is the theory? The theory behind the decentralization of resources is that counties or subnational units will compete with each other to provide better services. They will learn from each other. What are other counties doing? Why aren't we doing that? And the public will also ask, but Kisumu is doing this, but Turkana is doing this, but Makueni is doing this. But that will not happen if the data is not available in a centralized place for us all to see what the different units are doing. So, I want to end by just suggesting that we need to put pressure on national institutions to take responsibility, not to wash their hands and say, the counties are independent now, so we don't care about that data. We won't collect that data. That is what has happened. The Ministry of Health does not collect data systematically on what counties are doing in the health sector anymore, because they have said it is county function. And that is why Mokera has to run around the country talking to counties individually to get this data. We will not progress in this way. We will not develop in this way.
To start with history, history of a long time ago, anthropologists tell us that at least in the indigenous communities in what is now Kenya, as opposed to, for example, Uganda or bits of Tanzania or Nigeria, we didn't have much distinction between people. They were all treated equally. There was no hierarchy. There were no chiefs. So that most communities, which now make up the Republic of Kenya, lived in very egalitarian societies and had not heard of chiefs until the British colonial powers came. Well, then what happened? The next stage is the start of colonialism. So colonialism brought immediately distinctions, differences between different people, different groups. The immediate distinctions, of course, were between Europeans and Indians and, of course, the indigenous people. And the distinction, of course, was very clear. I mean, you are all, fortunately, didn't grow up in a colonial context. I did, and I know how nasty, vicious that distinction was. Distinctions that you felt in all spheres of life, in the salaries they get, in the allowances. They took away so much valuable land from the indigenous communities and made them kind of slaves. And then we had independence. And we thought perhaps now we will really have equality, everybody will be treated. The concept of citizenship then began to take root. And if you're a citizen, it doesn't matter what color you are, what religion you are, what languages you speak, that we are all entitled to equal treatment. But that didn't happen, as we know. And this time, it didn't happen because some African leaders, including the distinguished Jomo Kenyatta, had their own ideas. And it was an idea of tribalism. As we are seeing right now in our country, we are paying the price for placing some tribes over others. And our elections are really only about which tribe will take over. And they became, and so these distinctions began to arise through the capture of the state, because Jomo Kenyatta had not any money, but once he became the prime minister and then the president, provided facilities for people of his own tribe, and there was a lot of discrimination. And so this was, again, we are now all citizens, but some are more citizens than others. And I think, the basis of discrimination was the state, because he had no money of his own, he had no power of his own. So that has continued with us. And therefore the state played this critical role, as it did in the colonial times, where the British had the state, they had the military, they had the army, and they could do what they wanted. And instead of turning into a democratic, open society, Jomo Kenyatta just continued the structures of the colonial system, and the state to this day is the major instrument that Uhuru is fighting for, that Raila is fighting for, because that is not that they are going to do anything to improve our living standards, but because they want to be rich themselves. So let me then quickly move on to the second thing that I want to say, was to bring it forward to the time when we began to work on the new constitution, which took birth as the 2010 constitution. So I was then, I was myself in exile abroad, teaching at that time in Hong Kong. So I came back after 14 years abroad and agreed, okay, that I would help with the constitution making, provided that it was a genuine process, there was complete freedom of people to make their statements, and also at that time, you know, there were two sort of movements going. One was led by Moi, therefore not very progressive, and the other led by civil society, Willie Mutunga, others were involved, which was very progressive. And I said I would only take this job if the two groups could merge and we could work as one team. And after 3 months of negotiation, we did succeed in that, and then the process really started. Now I'm telling you about this process because I'm going to read to you from a document that which was this is a document, says report of the CKRC, short version, the People's Choice. This was reporting on the draft that we had produced after very wide consultations with the people. At one stage I summarized 13 main points that I had drawn from the people. The first one was, people said, give us a chance to live a decent life with the fundamental needs of food, water, clothing, shelter, security, and basic education met by our own efforts and the assistance of the government. They weren't asking for free things, they were said by our own efforts. We want a fair system of access to land for the future and justice for the wrongs of the past. So they were asking for justice, not just getting gifts. Let us have more control over the decisions which affect our lives, bring government closer to us, and let us understand better the decisions we can't make ourselves, but which affect us deeply. Just don't decide for us, discuss with us. We do not want power concentrated in the hands of one person. We want our MPs to work hard, respect us and our views, and the power to kick them out if they don't. We want to be able to choose leaders who have qualities of intelligence, integrity, and sensitivity which make them worthy of leading us. We want an end to corruption. We want police who respect citizens and who can be respected by them. We want women to have equal rights and gender equity. We want children to have a future worth looking forward to, including orphans and street children. We want respect and decent treatment for the disabled. We want all communities to be respected and free to observe their cultures and beliefs. We assert our rights to hold all sections of a government accountable, and we want honest and accessible institutions to ensure this accountability. Now, that's the big agenda, and it came from the people. Now, if you have, I hope all of you have read the Constitution, you will find these certain things recurring again and again. It wasn't something that we, got out of our own minds. We were responding very much to what people told us. So if you read the Constitution, next time you read the Constitution, underline the word equity and equitable. And you will find equity appears 4 times, equitable appears 14 times. So clearly, equitable was seen to be important because equality means that you get the same treatment. But equal treatment may not always be a fair treatment. So equity had this notion that you have to look at the overall picture, and you see that some counties are doing quite well. This is an example that we were told just now, that some counties need more assistance because of their historical backwardness, deprivation, and so on. So have we succeeded or not in our quest for equality and equity? And perhaps I feel that we have to say no, things have got worse. The rich have become obscenely rich, and yet we have some of the poorest people in the world in Kenya. And it is not the kind of Kenya that we envisaged when we wrote this constitution.
Now, devolution and generally the whole concept of us changing the constitution, there was, I think, a credible belief that marginalization was a big issue in Kenya and we needed to change the way we distribute resources as a country. While devolution is great and those funds have their own merits, the discussion about the bigger budget has remained non-existent, in fact, in many of the conversations. And so what we tried to do with this research is to try and see how is the distribution in the broader budget that has remained at the national level, which is way bigger than what you have with the counties. Are we equitable in how we are distributing development projects across the country? Now, in 2016-2017, in the national budget, the government, for some good reason, decided that they were going to present the development budget, not so much in terms of the monies for development going to the departments within ministries, but they decided that they were actually going to list each individual project under the departments and ministries at the national level. Of course, it's quite a huge number of projects, but we decided to focus on the State Department for Infrastructure and the State Department for Water Services. And this was for simple reasons. Number one is that these are two departments that, first of all, have a huge allocation of resources. For roads, quite a lot of money has been going into the roads department for the last 4 or 5 years. For water, this is interesting because water is one of those services that is devolved, but there's still a substantial amount of money that has remained at the national level. For the road side, we actually split those roads into 3 different categories. We group them into national, regional, and county roads. The national ones is quite depressing, if I can say, or a very frustrating category, because this is the category that had roads that we could not tell where they were. They were very ambiguous. So things like low volume seal roads, you can't really tell where they are, but they have quite a substantial amount of money allocated to them. For the regional roads, these are roads that basically are being constructed but across borders of counties, but they are within the same region. So if you think about the coast, for example, if there's a road from Mariakani to Mombasa, it's crisscrossing Kilifi, Kwale, getting into Mombasa County. So we kind of graded such roads as regional roads. Then we had county roads. These are basically roads that are connecting different points but within county boundaries. For water projects, this one was also took a different dimension because the investment in water projects in Kenya is really done around the water towers that we have in the country, the water catchment areas. So the regions within which we grouped water projects were areas where the water service boards operate. So each water catchment area has its own water service board, and there are counties that fall under each of the water service boards. As I mentioned, there is a category that we had, and this was in water and in roads. We had a category that we really couldn't tell what those projects were. They were very heavily funded, but at the same time, because of the way they were presented in the budget, it was not possible to tell where they are going to be implemented. And under roads, more than half of the allocation for development in that department, we could not tell what projects these are and where they'll actually be implemented. So 56% of the development budget for roads fell under that very ambiguous category. Counties, the roads that were able to place under counties took 36% of the budget, and the regional ones took about 8%. For water, that broad ambiguous category took about a third of the budget, 32%. So how do we measure the need? For roads, and let me start with roads at the top, is that we use 3 measures of need to be able to try and get all the angles of how we can look at access to roads, then compare it to the allocations that we are able to see in the budget. The first one is that in 2016, the Transition Authority, before it went out of business, put out a gazette that showed all the roads in the country by name, all the roads that were going to be at the national level and all the roads that were going to be devolved to the counties. Now, that will be some very good data to make use of, but there was one challenge with that data, in that data did not tell us of those roads, how many kilometers of those roads are actually already constructed, and how many are roads that we think we will construct in the future. Right now, they are just dirt roads. So in a way, looking at that data and using it is you are thinking of Thika Road in Nairobi in the same breath as a dirt road somewhere in Mandera. So we were very conservative in trying to use that data, and we actually left it out. However, colleagues from the World Bank had shared with us some data that showed paved and unpaved roads in all the counties. So one measure is simply to look at the unpaved road, because if you have an unpaved road, we need to pave it. That seems like a direct investment we have to make. So we look at, of all the unpaved roads in the country, what share does each of the county actually account for? So that will give us a measure of the need that exists in terms of roads that needs to be paved. At the same time is that roads are constructed joining places over land. So if you are a very wide county and we have to connect 2 towns in your county, probably then that's something we need to take account of, because if you're connecting settlement areas in a smaller region, then probably it might not be as expensive. The third one is that, of course, roads are supposed to serve people. So if people have access, if a lot of people have access to roads, then that's a good thing. If very few people have access to a road, then that, with good roads, which in this case is paved roads, then that's something also to take into account. For water, we simply looked at access to improved sources of water. So we already have data for this from the last census, and a number of these data sources have actually been put together by Society for International Development and the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. And also, I saw there's an atlas that was put out by the State Department for Planning, I believe, last year. So that tells us simply who has access to good water, and also is broken down all the way to the ward level. So let's start at the beginning. So how much money went where? So leave alone the first category where we could not tell what projects were in the budget. For the scenarios where we could tell where a project was to be in terms of counties, this is the spread you see in terms of allocations. As you can see, the top 10 has what I would call the usual culprits. Nairobi is at the top of all the 47 counties, and the allocation made to those projects, 22 or basically 23% of that allocation is for the county that you guys are in, which is Nairobi. Then followed by Mombasa with about 16%. So you can see just those 2 counties take almost half of the budget. Okay? So that's something interesting to note. Now, if you look at the bottom, Vihiga, Lamu, and the rest, they're almost getting nothing. So you can see there are 8 counties actually that had 0. Now, the top 10 counties in terms of the shares of unpaved roads. So when we look at the top 10 counties, they accounted for about 40% of all the unpaved roads in this country. However, when it comes now to the allocation, they only allocated 12% of that capital budget. Now, for the top 10 counties, in terms of paved roads, the average is actually 1 kilometer of paved road for every 8 kilometers square of land. So when you compare that to the average, that is pretty good. But they were allocated 55% of the budget. So guys with very good access are getting over half of the budget for 10 counties. Now, the bottom 10, the average is 6,814. Again, when you compare that to the average, you can see that that is actually quite bad. But how much do we allocate them? Just 10% of the budget. Now, to our last measure of need is we basically look at those same paved roads by the number of people who have access to them across the counties. So the top 10 counties, on average, there are 4,632 people, who have access to a paved road on average. Now, when you look at the bottom 10, for every kilometer of paved road, it's 164,000 people who have access to it. Again, that has very good access to roads. If you take it in terms of the population that has access to paved roads, they are getting 60% of the total development budget. For the group that already has a population that has very little access to paved roads, 10 counties at the bottom are getting 13% of the budget. For water, this was pretty simple. For the water service boards, we have 8 of them. Using the census data, as I mentioned, 47% of the Kenyan population do not have access to an improved source of water. An improved source of water is simply to say we are providing you with clean water. Now, Athi Water Service Board is the water board that covers Nairobi and Kiambu counties. When we look at people who do not have access across the country and we take the share that each of the county contributes to that total, Nairobi and Kiambu only contribute 6% out of 100. Okay? But in terms of the allocation to that water service board, based on the number of projects that we were able to find in the budget, 32% of that budget went to Nairobi and Kiambu under the Athi Water Service Board. So you can already see the interplays there. Rift Valley Water Service Board in the Rift Valley had the highest allocation across all the water service boards, with it getting 51% of the budget. The sum total of this is that out of the 8 water service boards, 83% of the budget is only going to 2. That is the Athi Water and the Rift Valley Water Service Board. So in conclusion, I think one of the things that we think is a positive is that the national government, for once, put out this information that was able to help us do this kind of analysis. It's not perfect because, as you see in that last point, is that the fact that we have a huge chunk of the budget still under budget lines that are not specific, so we don't know what investments we are actually making with a huge chunk of our budget, then that still remains a challenge in terms of the data. And in addition to that is that we also don't know of these projects how many were actually new projects starting in 2016, 2017, and how many were actually ongoing projects because that information is not really provided in the budget. So in a way, our analysis is not really complete when you don't have that full set of information.
The Commission on Revenue Allocation is mandated to come up with a policy that determines, a policy that reviews and comes up with a criteria for identifying marginalized areas. And that's explained in Article 216 of the Constitution. Now, the reason we come up with a policy is for the purpose of a fund that has been created through the Constitution. Again, Article 204 of the Constitution. It's called Equalization Fund. This fund is earmarked to assist in bringing areas that were hitherto or before then left behind in terms of provision of basic services. And so these are the things that this small fund is earmarked to cure. As a commission, when we came on board in the year 2011, we came up with a policy, and by 2013, we had done a policy. And in this policy, we identified areas that are marginalized. And we used a county as the unit of analysis. One, because of data. We didn't have enough data to go to lower areas. Two, that time, you know, there was this hype about devolution, and everything was county-based. So we were carried by that weight. And so we used county as our unit of analysis. And we identified 14 counties, and they're listed there, Turkana being one of them, Mandera, Wajir, Marsabit, Samburu, West Pokot, Tana River, Narok, Kwale, Garissa, Kilifi, Taveta, Isiolo, and Lamu counties. Now, this policy has been in use for the last 3 years, 2014, 15, and 16, to share revenue from the Equalization Fund. Remember, the role of the commission is only to come up with a policy. Somebody else shares the policy, shares the revenues, and gives the money to these areas. And this somebody else is the national government. So we do a policy, we come up with a criteria, then hands over the criteria to the government to implement. And so, as I said, we used different approaches to identify the marginalized areas. First, we came up with an index called County Development Index. This is an index that has indicators on the 4 areas that I mentioned: water, electricity, health, and roads. But remember, in the Constitution it says including, meaning we are not limited to these areas, to the 4 dimensions. 2, we used another approach of, we did a survey, just to find out from the grassroots what they feel about marginalization, and if at all they consider themselves as marginalized. Then we also commissioned a study on historical injustices. So we did a report and triangulated the 3 methodologies, the 3 approaches, to come up with a list of marginalized areas, the ones that I mentioned earlier. So on the County Development Index that I've said explains much of the identification of the marginalized areas, we used dimensions of poverty, infrastructure, health, education. And on poverty, we used the gap. You know, there are different measures of poverty, incidence and the rest, but we decided to use the gap. And it was weighted at 16%. Then there was also infrastructure. On infrastructure, we are using roads, electricity, and water. Those are mentioned in the Constitution, and we gave them 28%. We also have health at 28%, immunization. Those are the indicators: immunization, sanitation, and deliveries in health facilities. And last, we use education. We use education just to assist us come up with the index. And on education, we use the literacy rates and secondary education enrollment as some of the indicators. So apart from coming up with the policy and identifying the marginalized areas, we also came up with the criteria of now dividing the money. 50% is shared equally among the 14 marginalized counties. 50%. Then 50%, the other 50% is shared based on the CDI, the one that we just discussed, the County Development Index. So now, after we do that, we submit the criteria to who? The national government. And in the national government, the person responsible is the CS Treasury, National Treasury. And at the Treasury, they come up with guidelines on how to manage the fund. That's now their role. So they came up with guidelines, and they formed an advisory board consisting of PSS from 7 ministries. And the function of the board is to advise the CS on the proper and effective performance of the fund. That first policy was operational for only 3 years, and the 3 years have passed. And so the Commission is in the process of coming up with another policy. We call it the second policy, identifying marginalized areas. And the review will inform the preparation of the second policy, as I've said, which will be in operation starting this financial year. And this time, the policy won't be used for 3 years. Instead, it will be used for 5 years. And so far, we've held a lot of stakeholder forums, and we've done a lot of data analysis with the KNBS, and we are getting technical assistance from World Bank. We want to go lower, as he said. It's called sublocation. That's the lowest administrative unit that we can get data on. And the data that we are using is from 2009 census, plus the KIBIS data. KIBIS is Kenya Integrated Budget Household Survey that was done sometime last year. So we want to use the two data to come up with robust results.
Allocation of resources is actually subject to an approved plan. Under the public finance management, no money shall be spent outside an approved plan. And therefore, the sequencing of investments is in the Vision 2030 and a medium-term plan and an integrated development plan. And every budget office is a budget entity is required to have an integrated development plan. Now, I can comment about equity. Equity, under the Constitution, we are required to address areas and groups. So far, we have not done that. We have only talked about area. And the reason why that is in the Constitution is because the poorest people are usually near the richest. You see, people who live in the slums around Muheza, around Karen, are among the poorest. On the issue of marginalization, we have not discussed about groups. But I can tell you, Professor, that the worst marginalization occurs in Senegal. When people are taken to detention, then the colonial government ordered class demarcation. Those people became the poorest people this country has had. Nobody has mentioned about these people. And having grown and gone to school in primary school during the colonial system, I know some of them. They are the most bitter people I have met anywhere. And have the advantage to go about that country, that's different countries. And that is one area where we have shied away.
Well, we were of course concerned with regions, counties and so on, but there are also people who are disadvantaged, one reason or the other, who don't all are concentrating in one place. And if you look to Part 3 of the Bill of Rights, which is called a Specific Application of Rights, it identifies a number of groups who would not necessarily be covered by the discussion about or the allocations on a regional basis, and these are children, persons with disabilities, youth, minorities and marginalized groups, older members of society, people like myself. And so for each of these, the liabilities they normally suffer are identified, and there's an obligation on the part of counties, governments, it applies across and it sets out how their weaknesses, their discrimination can be redressed. I don't think we gave too much attention to relationship between groups and regions or counties, but we were aware that certain groups are spread over the country and have traditionally been discriminated against, and that we shouldn't forget them. And also, if you look at the chapter on devolution, the very first article which starts the discussion on devolution, it's mentioned clearly that the communities living there discriminated should be integrated and should have representation in parliament and in other areas. So I think that's the way we treated with that category of people, and how far that has succeeded, I don't really know. I haven't followed that, but we have, Katiba Institute, we have represented some people like that, some people who are, their livelihood is through migration and whether they're herders and so on. And our view is that they are very badly treated and they are kicked off the land and other people take them over. We have gone to court, we have won the cases, but the implementation is impossible.
Two very important things have happened in the past 1 year that I think can make very good contributions to this whole issue. The passage of the Access to Information Act, and also earlier on last year there was, I think the Ministry of Devolution released a set of guidelines on public participation. So something else coming out very clearly in your discussion is there's lack of information on the issues that you guys are trying to, comment on and just analyze. Within that law, there's disclosure kind of obligation. Do you think that will help a lot? My answer would be yes, but I'd like to hear more from you. And also looking at equity, the discussion on equity from the perspective of the person at the ground, issues of participation. How do you think that will help, for example, in the creation of your policy going forward? How ready are you to have public participation in the creation of that?
I think these are nice things, and I hate going the cliche of Kenya develop good things but we don't implement them. I really don't want to go that route, but these are some of the things that are falling in that category. So we have a very nice, well-thought Access to Information Act that was passed last year after staying in Parliament for almost 10 years, or for more than 10 years. But how many people are actually using it to try and access information that is in government? If I ask right here, how many of us have seen that act? Just by a raise of your hands. How many have seen the Access to Information Act? Okay, so about what? Almost half of the room. How many of us have actually tried to use that act and the guidelines given in it to access information from a government entity?
The Katiba Institute has got 3 cases,
Three.
and one each time, still waiting for the information. Yeah.
So Prof is basically catering for many of us, and Mukera has also tried it. So we've not really gotten to a point where we are using them, but I still see the opportunity because ideally it should not be a case that we have to use such things to be able to access information. As Jason was saying earlier, it's supposed to be the good thing to do. So in cases where that's not happening, then we are supposed to use the acts. When we use the process as Mukera has done and it's not working, then you go the route that Katiba has gone, where you actually even go the litigation way. So there's still a challenge in terms of how are we applying some of these new things that we've passed in the past few years that will actually make some of these gaps that we are discussing today non-existent.
During your research, are there outright acts of discrimination? Because I haven't heard that come out in any of the presentations. It's all about equity and equitability. But are there outright acts of discrimination in how funds are allocated? And I think the guy from CRA would also input a bit into that.
CRA, as a commission, we are dealing with just a small segment of the groups that we've mentioned, the marginalized. Now, these are the groups, including the elderly, the youth, and the women. In the past, there have been a lot of government initiatives, interventions that try to assist these groups. If you remember, there are a lot of funds that have been set up for the youth, the Uwezo and the rest, Women Enterprise Fund. The elderly, I understand they get some transfers now. Children, remember bursaries are there. And so there are interventions that the national government, including county governments, most county governments have bursary schemes for children. And so the government, apart from the policy that we're coming up with, they have also come up with a lot of interventions to also assist groups that we call marginalized groups in the society.
My name is Joshua Ngwai. I work for the German Foundation for World Population. When I was looking at the presentation, I was wondering, is it a deliberate effect that politics affects the allocation of resources, or is that coincidence?
Now, that is the discussion that actually the data is supposed to bring up. Is that what exactly are we seeing from this? Because from our own analysis, and we try as much as possible to speak from things that we can see from information we have, is we try to understand, is it because of population? Because most of those counties that you see with very high allocations, some of them are from the very highly populated areas. So could it be, and there are many people who believe in this theory, that you develop people, you don't develop places. So even if Marsabit is very big and without a road, and there is Kajiado next door with very many people, then you need to build a road in Kajiado because many people will access it. You've had those arguments. Jeru is laughing because probably he knows some of the culprits in that group. So we tried to understand it from that side, but we couldn't really get to an answer. And at the same time, some of the areas that have the highest allocations, for example, if you look at roads, it's Mombasa. So Mombasa might not come out as the most politically correct, as we like calling it, place. But at the same time, I think it's trying to understand the nuance. And that's why I was speaking of if we had information in these documents telling us that Nairobi is receiving the highest allocation because this is the place where you have the highest population in the country, or this is where you have a lot of what we need to make look colorful to attract investors, then we will be having a discussion about proposals that have been put on the table. Right now, we are basically throwing darts in the air because we do not know why that happened. And it can be interpreted in very many ways, and discrimination is one, political correctness could be another one. It's just that wide. But the fact that I'm sitting here today telling you I don't know is because there is no information I have looked at in the last 1 year that gave me any direction as to why exactly did we invest in activity A and not activity B.
My question is to you, Justin. Is there research that has been done on question of debt? Like this regime came from 2013 now. Is there research that has been done to show what is the implication of the debt? Maybe like how many people or million people the regime has taken back poverty, that people cannot access or accessing healthcare before, shelter, education, but now they cannot access. As you pointed that collection of the data is very important. And maybe the question of debt, how that has impacted to the distribution of resources, maybe to the county and to different areas. Has that been done?
I know John is starting to undertake some work. We are starting to undertake some work on debt. I think, of course, there's a question about intergenerational equity when you take on debt. We are borrowing now. Who's going to repay that debt, and who's going to benefit from the projects? So I can't say that there's clear research that has been done, but there's some research on the way. Although it is important to note that much of this infrastructure investment, which John talked about today, is funded by debt. So when we are talking about these projects, not all of them, and some of the ones which we don't actually have the distributional information for, but a large share of the infrastructure budget in Kenya is still funded by borrowing. So that what we are seeing here is how the money that we are borrowing then is being distributed to some extent.
My name is Brian. I work with the Institute for Social Accountability. My question goes to Otiwa. One of the criticisms of the national policy is that the services they offer, the areas they use, like the water and the road and health, are devolved, and still the national government is supposed to cater for the services. Why is it so? Is there not a conflict in that sense? How unclear now?
The reason behind it is that in as much as we had a lot of hopes in devolution, that it would take service delivery next to the people, it was considered that there are pockets of marginalization, pockets of areas that are really not at par with the rest of the areas, and so that needed some kind of an action, something that could assist them rise so fast with some special attention through this fund, so that they catch up, even as county governments try to provide services for the rest of the areas, they needed some interventions that will assist them come up and be at par with the rest of the area.
I don't think we should confuse the existence of the fund or the constitutional requirement for a fund with the necessity of Treasury to set up a advisory board. That is not in the Constitution. The decision to set up an advisory board is a reflection of the fact that the Constitution says that the Equalization Fund can be used as a conditional grant, or it can be exercised directly by the national government. And the decision that was made was to exercise directly by the national government. And then it followed from that an advisory board was set up. Had the decision been made to give it as a conditional grant, which is what some of us have said should have been done, there will be no necessity for an advisory board. So we should not confuse the two things. The fund, which is the financial regulatory framework for how it is governed, from how it is actually administered or spent.
The Equalization Fund Advisory Board, do they take into account public participation? Because if you're discussing about areas that are, if you're going to invest in an area that is not developed, does it have people, or is it the development is just done in that area because that area is not marginalized?
I say yes, because in my presentation, I said that during the selection of projects, the board went out to the 14 marginalized counties and with the assistance of the citizens in the areas that are marginalized, they selected the projects. And so these are projects that were agreed upon between the board and the citizens in the areas. And so I say yes, there's a lot of public participation in the management of the fund.
It says, okay, suppose these recommendations are not taken in by the government. Is there a way in which they can be enforced to take up the recommendations?
The point we are trying to make with this is that when you're having discussion about equity and you're trying to think of how to reduce inequalities that exist in the country, is that many a times that discussion has been framed as a discussion that should happen in very high-level discussions that the David Ndis of this world and the Njerus of this world should sit in. And one of the things that we are trying to say is that that discussion can actually happen at the sub-location level where CRA is taking the marginalization policy discussion, because all you need to tell people is we are making this decision today and we are thinking of, doing X and not Y this time because of 1, 2, 3 reasons. Then let people debate that. So it's basically pushing the budget from one of these discussions where decisions are just made for you to more of let's deliberate and agree on what to do now and what to do in the future.
I know all counties have the County Integrated Development Plan, and that's the guiding force of how budget is allocated. So the question is, do counties have the capacity to spend all the money that they are given? Because if they don't allocate enough, or rather if they don't advocate for more money from national government, more often than not, it's not cascaded in the first place, or rather dispersed.
Two broad points. Number one is that CIDPs should form the general development direction that a county wants to go towards. Now, the very first ones, we didn't do that well. I think for many of us who are engaging with counties, we bumped into Nairobi parachute consultants all over the place, developing CIDPs. Some of them were kicked out by county assembly, so we didn't do that well that first time. And that implied that some of the CIDPs that we saw had very huge projects that would take an amount of money to implement that counties cannot even get within the 5 years. So some of the how realistic those CIDPs were is also something that probably we can correct as we prepare the current ones. Which then comes to the point of absorption, and I think this is something that has very many facets to it. So why are counties not able to absorb all the money that they get from their local resources and what they get as national transfers? And there have been many arguments on this. So the governors and the Council of Governors have always raised the issue that the disbursements sometimes are late. And so that means that all these projects that they are trying to do, all these programs that they are trying to implement, then they are not able to do them on time. There have been arguments about just the human capacity in the counties. Do they have engineers to do all the necessary paperwork and surveys that you need to do before you build a road and so on and so forth? So there are many angles to the absorption discussion, but the good part, which I think has been sometimes misrepresented in the public, is that even if the year comes to an end and you've not absorbed your money, that money remains with the county. So it just goes to the county revenue fund. So there is a discussion about the efficiency of the uptake of monies in the counties, but there are very many sides to that discussion that we need to correct all round.
Are there any studies to show that there's a gross county income or gross county, something that would cumulatively add to the gross national income or the gross development product?
One of the things that we've pushed counties a lot on is that they need to get a bit more creative and efficient in terms of their local revenues that they have to collect. So minus what they get from the national transfers is that they need to work harder to collect more domestically. And one thing that will really help is knowing what the county GDPs will do. So GDPs, GNIs are something that will be very helpful as counties are trying to get a bit more predictive of how much they can collect over time and what is actually the ceiling in terms of the maximum that you can really hit. Now, the challenge is that this is not something that we have. County GDPs is a discussion that I've had in quite a number of forums. There have been some efforts from the World Bank. So the World Bank released something a few years ago on county GDPs where they basically used this satellite imaging thing where you look at the spread of lights across the country and then you kind of try and predict the economic activity in a place based on how much electricity connection you're able to see from space. Now, with rural electrification, I don't know how accurate that is because everyone gets electricity even if they live in a thatched house. So there have been some efforts, but I think it's necessary if we are going to keep pinning counties down on their revenues, that they will only be able to predict well if that information is, and that falls directly under where KNBS sits.
So it does touch on that. And I'm not sure about the issue of declining access to services. I think, one of the challenges that we have with increasing access to services, declining access to services, whatever we are talking about, is the very slow pace of data production. So it was mentioned by Job that they are using the 2009 census plus the household budget survey. Now, the household budget survey is fairly recent, but it isn't published yet. So CRA has some privileged access to that survey, but it has not yet been published. The last household budget survey was done in 2006. So we have been waiting we are getting to the 12th year since the last survey was done, and we don't have the data yet. Every time it is about to be released, there's some kind of election or some related political event. So we are therefore using outdated information, and it is very difficult then to track change over time, which is of course what we are interested in. And that's where the work that Mokera did and presented yesterday, trying to look at how access to human resources in health is changing over time since 2013 up to today, is very important. But it's not based on a comprehensive survey then, it's based on picking pieces of data from different places. So we have to resolve that issue. And I think I also just wanted to speak to the access to information. Of course, I hope John will be putting in the access to information request on the low volume seal roads to know where they are being spent. But I do want to point out that even with a functional access to information, which we don't have, Professor Guy has mentioned that they have not been, even after going to court, they have not gotten the data. After going to court and winning, they have not gotten the data. The point I was making at the beginning still holds, which is that if you request data from a county using access to information, as Mokera, you will still have to go county by county to request this information unless we have a national repository of county data. And that is a very tedious process for anyone who wants to actually do analysis. So I'll stop there and let the others jump in.
My question goes to Mr. Otiwa. You talked about from the consultations you've had, some of the issues, or one of the issues that has been proposed is that the equalization fund should be made conditional to the counties. And my question is, what are these conditions that the people are proposing, considering that the policy that you're in the course of formulating now is supposed to last for 5 years? And if I look at the one that that has been applied for the last 3 years, it's picked out only 14 counties. And yet, in reality, the counties that are marginalized, especially in terms of access to water, they do not appear in those. Now, come this next phase, which would be for the 5 years, one, there is a proposition that is saying coming from the stakeholders that it should be, the fund should be made conditional. I wonder what condition goes back to what my friend here was saying in terms of, rather than looking at only allocations, also look at expenditure, whether indeed the allocations for this specific infrastructure projects are what is spent on the same or not. And two, if at all we are talking of having just a section, so what happens to the other areas which are marginalized for the next 5 years? Don't they have a right to access water which is enshrined in the Constitution? So how do we go about balancing this?
Currently, in the resource distribution framework between counties and national government, there are what you call conditional grants. Conditional grants are funds that are given to county governments to perform specific duties. These duties are national policy actions. Like if national government wants to achieve an action, like something that unifies the whole country, something that affects everyone, then they give conditional grants to counties because they are nearer to people to implement such projects. We understand? Like if they want to do immunization and they want to cover everyone, they'll give funds to counties to undertake that because they have the personnel and everything. But the condition is that you have to spend the money on that specific duty. Understood? So those are the conditions. Like for this one, the equalization fund, if you were to give it to counties, it will mean that we come up with a framework that tells counties that you have to spend this money on A, B, C, D. That's why we call it a conditional grant. That's simple. It's no magic. That's the condition, that you have to spend the money on this, and the money is coming from the national government. It's not your money. This money is only meant for this project, and we can't implement it because we are at the national level, and you have the personnel and the technical capacity to do the work. That's why we are giving you the money. But you have to spend it on this specific project. That's understood.
My name is Rina Tuma from the Institute of Public Finance. My further clarification I'm seeking, we're talking about utilization fund getting to now the 14 counties using the fund. So how are they working around to ensure that now those counties are addressing the quality within the county? Not just for the 14, but all the counties.
We've come up with a policy. The policy has identified 14 counties. What about the rest of the counties that might be having intra-county marginalization? Like they say, Kiambu is doing so well. At the same time, you know that there's a pocket of marginalization in Kiambu, a place called Deya. Deya is so marginalized in a county that is doing so well. He also said that most of the slums are located in places that are just adjacent to the leafy suburbs. And so how do you tackle such areas? Now, CRA moving forward, after we do this policy, we'll come up with what we call a master plan. This master plan will go into every county. We'll come up with an index that identifies areas in all the counties, areas that we think are marginalized, based on the indicators that we'll have come up with, the ones that we're using for this policy, so that we share it with counties and tell them that this area, as much as it's not identified nationally as marginalized, it is marginalized if we compare it with the areas within your county. And so if the funds, or when you're coming up with your CIDP, remember to allocate funds for this area, like for water, electricity, and all these other elements of marginalization. So that's our next step, coming up with a master plan for each and every county to at least address intra-county marginalization.
First, I apologize, first I came in late, so I missed the presentation, but I know you have access to data, the 2016 KIHDS, but I wonder, what are you doing in ensuring that data is recent, up to date, complete, and accessible to all? Since it's accessible to you, what are you doing about the rest of us who are out here in the dark? And my second question, if I got you correctly, you mentioned that you focus marginalized sector groups as the elderly, the youth, the women. So I'd like to know, what about the people with disabilities? Is that not a priority? Is it an issue with the data? And I think also what you mentioned in terms of within the county, there are people who are marginalized within. So in terms of geographical distribution, why don't you also focus on those areas where poor people in a certain county?
Sorry, the last bit. Then on accessibility to data is a KNBS issue. Even the data that we use as a commission, we officially get it from the KNBS. So for CRA, we don't generate any data. The data that we use is officially from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, plus some data that we get from counties. And so on accessibility, data that we've processed, you can get it from our website, but we're not the original source of the data. We get it from other sources. Then PWDs, I think we talked about this, that the Constitution allows us to, allows the government to come up with affirmative action, affirmative programs that address marginalization, if you want to call it, for groups like PWDs, youth, women, and the elderly. And I think the government has done so well in terms of coming up. It's not enough, but at least they've tried. They're at least trying to address some of the inequalities within groups in the society.